Alright, we're gonna do the ultimate test right now. Is the camera pocketable? Look at that. It fits in your jacket's pocket with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens on there. It's amazing. This is the Sony Nex-5. This camera came out in May of 2010, and after 13 years later, is this camera still worth buying? And the short answer to that is probably gonna be yes, because this camera you can get it for really cheap nowadays. I got this camera for $129 from KEH. You can watch my previous video where I unboxed it and show you guys what it came with and everything. And this camera is pretty amazing for what it was back then, and even to this day, you can still get some great images out of it. Now, this camera has a 14 megapixel CMOS. I think it's a CMOS. I actually don't know what kind of sensor it is. It is a 14 megapixel crop frame sensor on it. So you're not going to be getting, it's the same depth of field or low light performance as you would get out of a full frame camera. But still, as long as you shoot at the base ISO, you can still get some really clean, good looking images out of this camera. Now, once you go into the higher ISOs, like this camera, I believe caps out at 128 ISO, the image quality does start to fall apart. The big advantage that the newer cameras have is that in the higher ISOs, the cameras do perform a lot better than what they did in the previous generations. And this camera, here, I'm gonna find the ISO, and it goes up to 128. Right there, as you guys can see. So it can't even shoot that high up in the ISOs, and even if you do shoot it, it just doesn't look that good. But if you stick to the lower ISO, the base ISO of this camera is 200, and the images coming out of it look pretty damn good. Now, one of the big reasons to buy this camera nowadays is, first of all, it's going to be the size. As you can see, this camera is tiny. This is the Sony A7, the first full frame camera that Sony made, and here's this one. As you can see, it's so much smaller than their full frame cameras. If we look at it from the top, you can see how much even smaller this camera gets. It's really tiny. Here from the bottom, right here. You can see this is a really small and light camera. You can definitely feel it. Now, I only shot with this camera with full frame lenses, but I have plenty of smaller full frame lenses. And once you put a tiny full frame lens on here, you can take some really great images. Of course, you can get even smaller APC lenses also with it, but I personally don't recommend people buy the APC lenses, mainly because when Sony's making lenses, they usually make their full frame lenses professional grade. And also, if you want to go into being a photographer or videographer professionally, I just recommend getting full frame lenses, mainly because you eventually gonna upgrade and get a full frame camera. So you want to be able to use your older lenses with the new cameras you're gonna get. But honestly, that is the beautiful thing about this camera, is that even though this is a cheap crop sensor camera, you can put expensive full frame lenses on here, and even though it looks a little ridiculous, you can still take some professional looking images with it. Now, if you want to, for example, just walk around and have a small setup, you can use something like this. This is the Rokinon 24mm 1.8 lens, and you put this lens on this camera, and as you can see, it just becomes a little small setup right here. This thing is actually pocketable. You can put it in your little jacket pocket. You won't be able to fit in your jeans or anything. Actually, you might be able to fit the camera in your jeans, depending on how big the pockets are. But if you want a small setup like this, you can do that. But if you want to go wildlife shooting or something, for example, you can grab something like this, which is a Tamron 72 180mm, and then you can attach it on there. And boom, now you can start shooting wildlife with this camera. Now, there are some caveats with this camera. Obviously, it isn't perfect. It's a lot older. It's the first Sony mirrorless camera that they made. So obviously, there's a lot of problems with this camera, and we're going to get into those. The first big issue with this camera is going to be the autofocus. Now when people think about Sony, they think about the amazing autofocus that the Sony cameras have. We're shooting with the Sony A7 IV right now, and as you can see, the camera just has a box around my eye, and it can perfectly track me without any problems at f1.4 no less. It just does an amazing job at it. But with these older Sony cameras, they did have a lot of problems when it came to the autofocus. Pretty much any camera that Sony made before the a7 III had autofocusing problems. So that's one of the reasons, like, if you're thinking about buying a Sony camera and you don't know which one to get, always get a Sony camera that was made after the a7 III. If it's made after the a7 III, it's going to have the amazing phase detect autofocus system. But if you get an older one, like for example this like original a7 camera, this camera also has pretty bad autofocus. Now for static subjects, it's usually fine. Even for that stuff, like sometimes it would look like it was in focus, but it wouldn't actually be in focus. Like I would check it on the computer and it would be like completely out of focus. So it's not the best autofocusing camera. So if you want to shoot any action, like for example, if you have kids and you want to take pictures of them, I would recommend getting a newer camera, because those cameras, you're gonna be able to take way better pictures that are gonna actually be in focus instead of trying with this and like failing with it pretty much. But if you're planning on shooting manual focus, like, this is perfect. And since this camera is the Sony E-mount, you can actually adapt any lens onto it pretty much. You can adapt Canon lenses, you can adapt like vintage lenses on here, and you can use any lenses that you pretty much have on this camera, which is really fun. One thing that I don't like about this camera is gonna be that it only has a back screen on it that's not the highest quality, and it's not touchscreen either, since this camera's from 2010. But it does have this slot right here. If you open this part up, you will notice like almost like a micro SD card looking slot on here. But this is for adding attachments to the camera. So you can actually add an EVF to this camera, which I don't have. I might get some accessories for this camera and just try them out, see how they work. But I know you can get an EVF and you can get a flash for this camera. And you can even get a hot shoe for this camera just by using that attachment slot. So there's a bunch of accessories you can get with it to customize this camera. Now, for me, the biggest problem with this camera is going to be the controls for the camera. For some reason, Sony, like people complain about like the menu system of the newer cameras and stuff, but this camera has probably one of the worst like controls I have ever seen. Because first of all, like you see like at the front of the camera right here, you have one button here, you have one button here, and then you have a circle pads here, but you can also click on each side and then you can click on the middle. Now that sounds great because you have like pretty much what, like 4, 6, around like 7 buttons and a circle pad on here. So it gives you a lot of options to map, but half of the stuff is just mapped in weird places. Like for example, there's a dedicated flash button. There's no flash on this camera. Like you can get a flash attachment, but there's no flash on this camera. So why is one of the dedicated buttons a flash button? Now there's this there's like a button right here also at the bottom, and you might be like, oh, is that for like, you know, changing the ISO, or is it for like selecting, you know, whatever mode you should know? That's like a help button that like shows you like how you can like, you know, frame a subject or something. Like it's completely pointless button. They could have just like, it could have been just like a tutorial thing in the menu that they could have hid away. So the controls for this camera are just really annoying, especially if you shoot in the manual mode, because if we switch to manual exposure right here, then you use the circle pad to change your shutter speed, and then you have to click down into changing your aperture. Why am I completely out of focus? Okay. You click down to change your aperture, and if you want to change your ISO, you have to click a menu, and then you have to go to brightness and contrast, and then you have to go to ISO right here, and then from there you can change it. It's just like a pain in the ass to do, so I just don't like using it that much. It's just really annoying. So a lot of times when I shoot with this camera, I just shoot in like aperture priority or shutter priority mode, so that I can just avoid, you know, having to go through the menus a bunch of times. So it's not really a camera that you want to get a manual shoot with, unless if you're gonna really plan out the shot, like if you're shooting landscape or something. But yeah, overall, I think it's a great camera to buy. Again, I got this camera for $130, so it's extremely cheap. And here, let me show you what the video comes out of this camera also looks like. Now, this camera can do 1080i, so it's not full 1080p like we're shooting right now, but it's the older Sony video codec, which isn't good at all. So you guys can see what that looks like compared to something like the a7 IV that's shooting the video. So right now we have the Sony a7 IV right here with the Rokinon 50mm 1.4, and on top of it I mounted the Sony Nex-5 with the Samyang 24mm 1.8. So it's not exactly, apples to apples, but it's pretty similar focal length. And as you can see, the image quality just isn't, up to par with what Sony a7 IV can do. And the Sony a7 IV can do, 4K 10-bit, and right now I'm just shooting at 1080p 10-bit. So it can do even better image quality than this. The Sony Nex-5 can only do 1080i, so it can't even do full 1080p. So I mean, I wouldn't use this camera for video. If you really want to, you can do it. But honestly, nowadays, I feel like even your phone would do better than a camera like this when it comes to video. But when it comes to the photography and you compare these two cameras, they're actually not that different. If you shoot at the base ISO, they look pretty similar. Obviously, one is a full frame camera, other one's a crop sensor camera. But in the base ISO, they both can take really good looking professional images. Now I'm going to do a whole separate video comparing these two cameras just to see, how far the Sony's, sensor technology has come. But for this video, we're just gonna, this is the only comparison you're gonna get. So yeah, as you can see, for video, I wouldn't get this camera, but for photography, you can still take great images using a camera like this. So I would recommend it if you can get it for a good deal like I did. Like if you can get it around $100, I'll say it's worth getting this, especially if you own a bunch of Sony lenses, then you can just use all of them on this camera. But anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. Hopefully it was useful. I make videos every single week, so make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Goodbye.